Deep inside a cave in eastern Spain, archaeologists found something that shouldn't be there. Not one inscription, not 10, not even 50. At least 120 Latin inscriptions, most of them written nearly 2,000 years ago, and 5 of them point to the same goddess. But there's a problem. We don't know her name. The Romans who came here seem to have called her Domina, the lady. And on 3 of those inscriptions, another word appears, Malici. It may have been an epithet, describing some aspect of the goddess. Researchers even suspect it could be connected to the water running through the cave. But they are not sure. This wasn't a random cave with a few ancient scratches on the wall. The inscriptions are concentrated in one particular chamber, more than 200 meters inside the cave. There are natural pools, bronze jewelry, ceramic vessels, spindle whorls, and evidence that women played an active role in the rituals performed here. So who was the goddess they came here to worship? Why did people travel so far underground to leave their names and offerings? And why is a cult that appears to have been organized and important enough to leave more than 100 inscriptions left behind almost no clear name? Today, we're going into Cova, and the deeper we go, the less this looks like an ordinary Roman cave. Cova lies near Millars, in Valencia, on Spain's eastern coast. The name itself translates roughly as Cave of the Women, and today, that name feels strangely appropriate. But the cave is much older than the Roman world we're about to enter. Much, much older. In 2023, researchers published the first major study of the cave's Paleolithic rock art. They documented more than 100 paintings and engravings, some of the imagery more than 24,000 years old, making Cova one of the most important Paleolithic rock art sites in eastern Iberia. In 2025, a separate study went even further, documenting more than 100 formations inside the cave that show signs of deliberate human modification, broken stalactites, altered surfaces, structures archaeologists call speleophacs. These weren't accidents of nature. They were changes people made to the cave itself, long before any Roman ever set foot inside it. This wasn't a place humans had wandered into once or twice. People had been using this underground landscape for thousands of years. They painted here, they engraved here, they changed parts of the cave itself. And much later, long after those prehistoric communities were gone, other people came back. The Romans didn't simply find an empty cave. They found a place that already had a long human history, and they turned part of it into something new. The Roman story only became visible recently. In 2024, archaeologists working deeper inside Cova discovered a chamber that would completely change how the site was understood, more than 200 meters into the cave. Inside, they found Roman inscriptions. At first, there were only about 15 known. That was already extraordinary. These weren't ordinary marks scratched by someone passing through. The texts were concentrated in a specific chamber. And there was something else. A Roman coin from the reign of Emperor Claudius had been placed between a fissure and a stalactite in the ceiling. It appeared to have been deliberately deposited as an offering. Suddenly, archaeologists weren't looking at a cave that happened to contain Roman writing. They were looking at a sanctuary, a Roman ritual space deep underground. The discovery suggested that people had deliberately entered this difficult environment to perform religious acts. And then, in 2026, the story exploded. During fieldwork in May and June of 2026, researchers returned to Cova and the number of known inscriptions changed dramatically, from roughly 15 to at least 120. Most appear to date to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. That's not a small update. That's a completely different archaeological site. Imagine finding 15 pages from a lost book. Interesting. Then someone goes back and finds more than 100. Suddenly, you aren't looking at an isolated clue anymore. You're looking at a pattern. And that's exactly what happened at Cova. The inscriptions are concentrated in the chamber researchers call the Roman sanctuary, covering walls and ceilings, surrounded by natural pools formed inside the cave. The pools, known as gores, collect water from the underground galleries. And archaeological material was found on the surface around these areas. 2 bronze rings, a bracelet, ceramic fragments, small chalice-shaped vessels, spindle whorls, animal remains, and other objects connected with activity inside the sanctuary. Now the question isn't simply, what are these inscriptions? The question becomes, what kind of ritual was happening here? Let's start with the people, because this is where the story gets more personal. Some of the inscriptions contain female names, and according to the researchers, that is one of the reasons they believe women played an active role in the sanctuary's ritual life, not just as spectators, not simply as people who happened to accompany someone else. The evidence points toward women actively participating in the cult. The objects support that interpretation. Among the finds are numerous spindle whorls, tools associated with spinning thread. The researchers caution that this doesn't prove every woman in the sanctuary was there because of textile work. But spindle whorls are traditionally associated with women's activities in the ancient world, and in this context they fit with the inscriptional evidence suggesting significant female participation. Then there are the rings, the bracelet, the small vessels, the pools, the writing. Taken together, the picture becomes much more coherent. People weren't just visiting a cave. They were leaving things behind. They were writing. They were making offerings. They were performing rituals in a particular location. And at least some of the people involved were women. But then we reach the part of the story that nobody can fully explain. Because the people who came here weren't simply worshiping a goddess. We actually know what they called her, at least partly. And that makes the mystery much bigger. 5 of the inscriptions are especially important. They are votive inscriptions, texts belonging to the tradition of dedicatory or offering inscriptions. And these 5 refer to the same female deity. The researchers say we can therefore be confident that this wasn't just a generic place where Romans came to perform unspecified religious acts. There was a specific deity, a specific cult, a specific ritual space. And the title used for the goddess was Domina, the lady. Now stop for a second, because Domina isn't a personal name in the way Juno or Minerva is. It's a title, an honorific, a way of addressing someone with status. And that tells us something. The people who worshipped this goddess considered her important enough to approach with reverence. But it doesn't tell us who she was. Was Domina the goddess's actual name? Probably not. Was she a local goddess? A Roman deity with a local identity? A hybrid figure created as Roman religion spread into Iberia? Or are we looking at a title that concealed a much older divine tradition? The evidence doesn't allow us to choose yet. And then there is that other word, the word that makes this story much stranger. Malici. 3 of the 5 inscriptions contain the word Malici, and right now, this is one of the biggest unanswered questions at Cova. Researchers describe it as an unprecedented designation for a goddess. The exact reading and interpretation are still being worked on. But one possibility is that Malici was an epithet, a specific title describing some characteristic or aspect of this deity. And the researchers have suggested that it may be connected with water. That is not a solved interpretation. It is a possibility. And this distinction matters, because once a mysterious word appears in an ancient inscription, it's very tempting to invent an answer. Maybe it means water. Maybe it means healing. Maybe it means mother. Maybe it refers to the cave itself. But archaeology doesn't work that way. 3 inscriptions give us the same unusual word. That's real evidence. Its meaning is still uncertain, and until the epigraphers finish their reading and interpretation, any confident translation would be speculation. But even without translating the word, something very important has already become visible. The goddess was not worshipped in a random corner of the cave. Her inscriptions were concentrated in a specific place, and that tells us the cult was organized. This may be the single most important point in the entire discovery. Researchers emphasize that the concentration of the inscriptions in one clearly defined area, away from the entrance, indicates an organized cult. 5 inscriptions dedicated to the same deity. A specific ritual chamber. Water retained in natural pools. Offerings deposited in those pools. Bronze jewelry. Ceramic vessels. Spindle whorls. And names carved into the stone. That combination is very difficult to explain as casual religious activity. People knew where they were going. They knew what they were doing there. And they were repeating something that other people had done before them. Think about what that means. At some point, someone entered the cave and decided, this is the place. Not the entrance. Not the daylight. Not the first chamber. This chamber, far inside the cave. Then someone else came, and another person, and another. Eventually, there were enough inscriptions that today's archaeologists can see the pattern. The cave preserved the behavior even though it didn't preserve the explanation. And that is why Cova is so valuable. We're not just looking at artifacts. We're looking at repeated human actions, where people stood, where they wrote, where they left things, and where water was present. The cave contains natural pools, not artificial fountains, not stone basins built by Roman engineers, but natural formations called gores that collect water from the underground galleries. Archaeological material was found in and around these spaces, which makes water a very obvious part of the story. But obvious doesn't mean proven. The researchers are considering whether the unusual designation Malici may have been related to water. If that interpretation eventually holds up, it would give us a very different picture of the goddess. Imagine entering a dark underground chamber. There is almost no daylight. The walls are covered with inscriptions. Water is collecting beneath your feet. And the object of worship is apparently associated, at least potentially, with that water. For people living in the Roman world, that combination could have been powerful. Water could mean health, purification, fertility, life, the ability of a community to survive. But again, we need to be careful. We don't have a complete ancient text telling us this goddess controls the water. We don't have a surviving myth. We don't have her story. We have fragments, and the fragments suggest a connection. That's all we can responsibly say today. And somehow, that makes the mystery better. There is another question hiding in plain sight. Why here? Why go more than 200 meters into a cave? Romans had roads, temples, cities, shrines in places where sunlight, architecture, and public space made worship visible. But this sanctuary was the opposite. Hidden, dark, enclosed, difficult to access. And yet people kept coming. The researchers themselves suggest several possible reasons for the long human importance of Cova. The presence of permanent water, the unusual subterranean landscape, and the possibility that the cave may have been relatively accessible despite its depth. And there's another possibility worth thinking about. A cave changes the experience of a ritual. You don't simply arrive, you leave the normal world behind. The temperature changes. The light disappears. Sounds behave differently. Water echoes through the stone. And eventually, you emerge into a chamber where the walls contain messages left by people who entered before you. We don't need to invent anything supernatural to understand why that could have mattered. The environment itself was unusual. For ancient people, that alone could give the place religious meaning. It's worth remembering that this wasn't unique to Cova. Across the Roman world, caves, springs, and underground chambers regularly became sites of worship, precisely because they felt different from ordinary space. Entering the earth itself, in many ancient belief systems, meant entering the domain of forces that daylight worship simply couldn't reach. This is where the history of the cave gets almost unbelievable. More than 24,000 years ago, people were making Paleolithic art inside Cova. Thousands of years later, prehistoric communities were intentionally modifying parts of the underground environment. Then came the Romans, writing inscriptions and making offerings here. Different people, different technologies, different religions, different worlds, but the same landscape kept attracting human attention. The researchers describe Cova as a place that appears to have remained important to human groups for millennia, and every new campaign has added another layer. In 2023, the Paleolithic art. In 2024, the Roman sanctuary. In 2025, more than 100 deliberately modified cave formations, called speleofax, showing intentional prehistoric transformation of the underground environment. And in 2026, the inscription count jumped from around 15 to at least 120. That means we aren't watching one archaeological discovery. We're watching archaeologists slowly reconstruct an entire history of why humans kept returning underground. So let's stop and separate the evidence from the speculation. We know that a female deity was worshipped at Cova during Roman times. We know at least 5 votive inscriptions refer to the same deity. We know she was addressed as Domina, the lady. We know 3 of those inscriptions contain the word Malici. We know the texts are concentrated in a specific chamber. We know the site contains natural pools fed by underground water. We know several female names appear among the inscriptions. We know there are artifacts that may represent offerings. And the researchers argue that women played an active role in the cult. Those are the solid pieces. Now the unknowns. We don't know the goddess's confirmed personal name. We don't know exactly what Malici means, or whether it is her name, an epithet, or another kind of designation. We don't know what people were asking her for. We don't have a surviving myth explaining her identity. We don't know how the cult fit into the larger religious world of Roman Iberia. And we don't know exactly why this particular cave became the place for it. That's the mystery. Not that we have no evidence. We actually have too much evidence without the key that explains it. And perhaps the most human part of this discovery is hidden inside those names. Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, women entered this cave. We don't know all of their names. We don't know their faces. We don't know where they came from. But some of them left their names behind. They carved into the walls. They made offerings. They entered a chamber that was already important to other people. And then they left. What happened in their lives after that? We don't know. Maybe they came because they were sick. Maybe they wanted children. Maybe they were asking for protection. Maybe they were giving thanks for something that had already happened. Maybe they came simply because their families had been coming here for generations. The inscriptions may eventually tell us more, but the researchers are still reading them. Some texts remain under study, and a large part of the cave still has not been examined in detail. That means the story is not finished. Not even close. The 120 inscriptions aren't the final chapter. They may be the beginning of the part of the story we can finally read. Maybe the real mystery isn't simply who is the goddess. Maybe it's this. Why did her followers need a place like this? Why leave the surface? Why enter the darkness? Why write your name on stone? Why leave jewelry? Why leave textile tools? Why place offerings near water? Why return to exactly the same chamber? And why did so many people continue doing it that the walls now preserve the evidence nearly 2,000 years later? One day, researchers may decipher Malici. They may identify the goddess. They may find another inscription that finally connects her to another deity or another sanctuary. Or they may never find the missing piece. And if they don't, Cova will still tell us something extraordinary. That the Roman religious world was more complicated than the famous names we usually remember. It wasn't only Jupiter, not only Mars, not only Venus. There were local gods, local rituals, local places, and beliefs that could disappear so completely that all we have left is a title on a cave wall. The lady. 2,000 years ago, someone walked into a cave in what is now eastern Spain. They passed through the darkness. They reached a chamber more than 200 meters inside. There was water there, stone walls, and the marks left by people who had come before. Maybe they had come asking for something. Maybe they had come to give thanks. Maybe they had come because they believed a goddess was listening. So they took a tool. They carved their name. And they called her Domina, the lady. Someone else came later. Then someone else. And another. Until the cave held more than 100 inscriptions. Then the cult disappeared. The people disappeared. The meaning of the word Malicide disappeared. But the stone remained. And for almost 2,000 years, the cave kept the secret. Today, archaeologists finally have enough pieces to know that this was not a random collection of graffiti. It was an organized cult. It involved women. It involved offerings. It involved water. And it centered on a goddess whose true identity has been lost. For now, because Cova is still being explored, more inscriptions are waiting to be read. More of the cave remains to be studied. And maybe the next campaign will find the one thing that changes everything, her name. Until then, we are left with a strange message from the past. 120 inscriptions, one forgotten goddess, and one question that has survived for nearly 2,000 years. Who was the Lady of Cova?